The stack of $100 bills sat between them on the yacht's polished mahogany table, crisp and green against the white linen tablecloth. Congressman Michael Myers leaned forward, his tie loosened after several drinks, his eyes fixed on the cash with an intensity that made the moment feel both ordinary and historic. The man across from him, dressed in traditional Arab robes and introducing himself as Kambir Abdul Rahman, pushed the money closer with manicured fingers, explaining in accented English that this was merely a gesture of friendship, a token of appreciation for the congressman's willingness to assist with certain immigration matters. Myers reached for the bills without hesitation, his hand steady as he pulled them toward himself. And in that gesture, captured by 3 hidden video cameras positioned throughout the yacht's cabin, he became the first sitting United States congressman caught on film accepting a bribe. What Myers did not know, what none of the politicians who would visit this yacht over the coming months could have suspected, was that Kambir Abdul Rahman did not exist, that the wealthy Arab sheikh was actually FBI agent Anthony Amoroso, wearing theatrical makeup and a fake beard, and that every word spoken in this cabin was being recorded as evidence in the most audacious political corruption sting operation in American history. The FBI's road to Operation Abscam began not with grand strategy, but with a small-time con artist named Melvin Weinberg. In 1977, Weinberg was facing federal fraud charges for running a series of elaborate investment scams that had defrauded victims across multiple states of hundreds of thousands of dollars. His operation was simple, but effective. He posed as a representative of wealthy foreign investors, promised to secure loans or financing for businesses and real estate deals, collected advance fees for his services, and then disappeared once the money was in hand. He had been running variations of this scheme for nearly 2 decades, constantly adapting his approach and reinventing his personas to stay ahead of law enforcement. When FBI agents finally caught him, Weinberg was 52 years old, overweight, balding, and possessed of a cynical worldview shaped by years of manipulating people's greed and desperation. He was also, as the FBI would soon discover, a natural-born operator with an intuitive understanding of human psychology and the mechanics of deception that made him uniquely valuable. Rather than prosecute Weinberg and send him to federal prison, FBI Supervisor John Good proposed an alternative. Weinberg would work as a cooperating witness and consultant, using his expertise in fraud to help the FBI catch other con artists and white-collar criminals. In exchange, the charges against him would be reduced, and he would receive payment for his services. Weinberg agreed immediately, recognizing that cooperation offered better prospects than incarceration. What began as a straightforward arrangement to catch fellow con artists evolved into something far more ambitious as Weinberg demonstrated his capabilities and the FBI recognized the potential applications of his methods. Within months of beginning his cooperation, Weinberg was helping agents design complex undercover operations, teaching them the psychology of the con, and personally participating in stings that resulted in significant arrests. His value went beyond mere informant status. He became an operational asset whose understanding of deception exceeded that of most career law enforcement officers. The operation that would become Abscam was initially conceived in early 1978 as a sting targeting stolen art and securities. FBI agents, working with Weinberg, created a fictitious company called Abdul Enterprises, supposedly representing wealthy Middle Eastern investors interested in purchasing valuable items. The choice of an Arab persona was deliberate and strategic. Middle Eastern oil wealth had become a prominent feature of international finance during the 1970s, with Arab investors purchasing significant assets in the United States and Europe. American businessmen and criminals seeking to sell stolen property or fraudulent securities would find the premise of wealthy Arab buyers entirely believable. Weinberg helped to design the operation's details, drawing on his years of experience to create a convincing facade that would attract targets without arousing suspicion. The initial operations were successful, recovering stolen paintings and securities while generating numerous arrests of dealers in stolen goods and fraudulent financial instruments. But Weinberg noticed something during these early operations that would change the direction of Abscom entirely. Several targets, when approached by Abdul Enterprises, mentioned that they had connections to politicians who could help with various problems in exchange for money. They spoke casually about bribing local officials, obtaining permits through payoffs, and navigating regulatory issues through political connections purchased with cash. These were not hypothetical discussions, but matter-of-fact descriptions of how business was actually conducted in their worlds. Weinberg recognized an opportunity that extended far beyond recovering stolen property. He approached FBI supervisors with a proposal. Use Abdul Enterprises not just to catch thieves and forgers, but to expose political corruption by offering bribes to elected officials and recording their responses. The proposal was simultaneously brilliant and dangerous, promising unprecedented evidence of corruption while raising profound questions about entrapment, ethics, and the appropriate limits of law enforcement deception. FBI headquarters debated Weinberg's proposal for months. The operational risks were significant. Targeting elected officials meant confronting powerful individuals with resources to fight back legally and politically. If the operation became public prematurely, or if courts later ruled that the FBI's methods constituted entrapment, the entire effort could collapse, careers would be destroyed, and the Bureau would face severe political consequences. There were also genuine ethical questions about whether the government should create fictitious scenarios specifically designed to tempt officials into criminal behavior, even if those officials demonstrated clear willingness to accept bribes. But the potential value was equally significant. Political corruption investigations traditionally relied on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and paper trails that defense attorneys could challenge and juries could doubt. Video recordings of officials actually accepting cash bribes would constitute evidence so powerful that convictions became virtually certain. After extensive internal debate and consultation with Justice Department officials, FBI Director William Webster approved the operation with strict guidelines. Targets would be approached only when evidence suggested existing corruption. Agents would not pressure or coerce anyone into accepting bribes, and every interaction would be carefully documented and recorded. The operational transformation of Abdul Enterprises required significant resources and planning. The FBI leased a house in the Melrose section of Long Island, New York, and converted it into an elaborate stage set representing the American residence of a wealthy Arab sheikh. Decorators filled the rooms with expensive furniture, Persian rugs, and Middle Eastern artifacts. Technicians installed hidden cameras and microphones throughout the property, concealed within light fixtures, wall decorations, and furniture, so targets would never suspect they were being recorded. The FBI also leased a yacht berthed in Florida, similarly outfitted with surveillance equipment and decorated to suggest wealth and luxury. These locations became theaters where the drama of corruption would unfold, environments designed to make targets comfortable, to create settings where discussing illegal transactions seemed natural and appropriate. The attention to detail was extraordinary, extending to the food served, the drinks offered, and even the background music, playing during meetings, all calibrated to reinforce the illusion of authenticity. FBI agent Anthony Amoroso became the operation's lead undercover operative, assuming the role of Tony DeVito, a representative of Abdul Enterprises, who arranged meetings between the sheikh and potential business associates. Amoroso was a veteran agent with years of undercover experience, but this assignment demanded skills beyond standard law enforcement work. He needed to convincingly portray a sophisticated middleman operating at the intersection of international business and political corruption, someone comfortable discussing multi-million-dollar deals while casually negotiating bribes. He studied the mannerisms and speech patterns of actual businessmen who operated in these circles, developed a persona that mixed charm with underlying ruthlessness, and practiced maintaining his role during extended interactions where any inconsistency could expose the operation. When the situation required the actual sheikh to appear, another agent named Michael Dennehy would don elaborate makeup, traditional Arab robes, and a carefully constructed accent to portray Kambir Abdul Rahman, the fictional source of Abdul Enterprise's wealth, and the man supposedly seeking political favors in exchange for investment dollars. Melvin Weinberg served as the operations director and psychological strategist, coaching the FBI agents on the subtleties of deception while making initial contact with targets. His role was crucial because his years as a con artist had taught him to recognize vulnerability, to identify which approaches would work with which personalities, and to navigate conversations in ways that led targets to incriminate themselves without creating legal grounds for entrapment claims. Weinberg understood that successful stings required targets to believe they were in control, that they were the ones driving the transaction rather than responding to pressure. He taught the FBI agents to present opportunities rather than make demands, to allow targets to propose illegal arrangements themselves, and to create environments where officials felt comfortable enough to reveal their true willingness to exchange political power for personal profit. His cynicism about human nature, forged through years of exploiting greed and dishonesty, made him uniquely qualified to predict how targets would respond and to design scenarios that exposed their corruption. The operation's first significant political target emerged through an intermediary named Angelo Ericetti, mayor of Camden, New Jersey. Ericetti had been introduced to Abdul Enterprises through connections in the stolen property investigations, and he quickly demonstrated both his own corruption and his willingness to broker introductions to other corrupt officials. During initial meetings at the Long Island House in 1978, Ericetti explained that he could arrange various political favors in exchange for payments, including assistance with casino licenses, building permits, and government contracts. He spoke with remarkable frankness about corruption as a normal feature of political life, describing politicians as businessmen who traded their influence for money, the same way merchants traded goods for cash. When Amoroso, playing Tony DeVito, mentioned that the sheikh might need assistance with immigration matters for business associates wanting to enter the United States, Ericetti responded immediately that he could arrange that through his connections in Congress for the right price. Ericetti's introduction opened a door that would ultimately expose corruption at the highest levels of American government. He claimed to have relationships with multiple members of Congress who would be willing to sponsor private immigration bills in exchange for cash payments. Private bills were a little-known congressional mechanism that allowed individual legislators to propose special legislation benefiting specific people, often used for immigration cases involving unique circumstances not covered by standard procedures. The process was legitimate when used appropriately, but Ericetti described it as essentially a service politicians could sell, using their official positions to grant favors in exchange for money. He proposed introducing Tony DeVito to these congressmen, facilitating meetings where the terms of such arrangements could be negotiated. The FBI recognized this as an extraordinary opportunity. If members of Congress actually agreed to sponsor immigration legislation in exchange for bribes, and if those agreements were captured on video, The resulting evidence would be irrefutable, and the prosecution's virtually guaranteed. The first Congressman Ericetti delivered was Michael "Ozzie" Myers, a Democrat representing Pennsylvania's 1st District, which included parts of Philadelphia. Myers was 44 years old in 1979, a former longshoreman who had risen through Philadelphia's Democratic political machine to win election to Congress in 1976. His reputation on Capitol Hill was that of a rough, unsophisticated politician, more comfortable in union halls and ward clubs than in congressional committee rooms. Someone who represented the old-school urban political culture, where loyalty mattered more than ideology, and politics was understood as a business rather than a calling. Ericetti assured the FBI that Myers would be receptive to their proposition, that he was a practical man who understood how things really worked and wouldn't be troubled by the transaction they were proposing. The characterization would prove devastatingly accurate. The meeting was arranged for August 22, 1979, aboard the FBI's yacht in Florida. Myers arrived with Ericetti, both men clearly comfortable with the luxury surrounding them, treating the yacht and its supposed sheikh owner as props in a business transaction they had conducted many times before. Amoroso, as Tony DeVito, welcomed them aboard, offered drinks, and after brief pleasantries, explained the situation. The sheikh had business associates who needed to enter the United States but faced immigration difficulties. Would the congressman be willing to sponsor private bills facilitating their entry? And if so, what would his fee be for providing this service? The question was direct but not coercive, offering an opportunity but not pressuring Myers to accept. Everything depended on how Myers chose to respond, whether he would recognize the proposition as illegal and refuse, or whether he would demonstrate the corruption that Ericetti had promised. Myers's response was captured on video with such clarity that when prosecutors later played the footage in court, jurors needed no explanation of what they were witnessing. He leaned back in his chair, smiled, and said he could definitely help with immigration bills, describing the process as simple and routine. When Amoroso asked what such assistance would cost, Myers quoted a price of $50,000 per bill. The number was stated casually, as if discussing the cost of any ordinary service rather than a sitting congressman pricing his official duties. Amoroso appeared to negotiate, suggesting that amount seemed high, and Myers responded with words that would become infamous. "I'm going to tell you something. Real, simple, and short. Money talks in this business and bullshit walks, and it works the same way down in Washington." The statement was both confession and philosophy, an admission that he accepted bribes combined with a worldview that saw such corruption as normal and universal. He continued talking, explaining that members of Congress routinely sold their influence, that the only question was price, and that anyone who claimed otherwise was either naive or lying. Amoroso then produced $50,000 in cash, stacked neatly in bundles on the cabin table. Myers looked at the money without surprise or hesitation, asked whether this was payment for one bill or multiple bills, and when told it was a down payment with more to follow, reached across and pulled the cash toward himself. He counted it quickly, divided it into stacks he could fit in his jacket pockets, and assured Tony DeVito that the immigration bills would be filed promptly. The entire transaction, from initial proposition to acceptance of cash, took less than 20 minutes. Myers showed no moral conflict, no hesitation, no awareness that he was committing a federal crime that would destroy his career and result in imprisonment. He treated selling his congressional office as casually as someone selling a used car, negotiating price and closing the deal with practiced efficiency. The video cameras hidden throughout the yacht's cabin recorded every moment, every gesture, every word, creating evidence so comprehensive that Myers's eventual conviction was never in doubt from the moment prosecutors played the footage. If you're still here, watching this moment when American democracy was tested from within, when the trust between citizens and their elected representatives was betrayed for stacks of cash, go ahead and like this video and comment the words "Truth Matters" below. Let's see how many of us still believe that exposing corruption, no matter how powerful the corrupt, is worth the risks and the costs of going after those who sell our government to the highest bidder. The success with Myers validated the operations approach and demonstrated that the FBI had created a mechanism capable of exposing congressional corruption with unprecedented effectiveness. But it also meant that Abscom had crossed a threshold. They were no longer investigating small-time criminals or local officials, but sitting members of the United States Congress, individuals with national platforms, political connections, and the resources to mount sophisticated legal defenses. FBI supervisors recognized that each additional congressman targeted increased both the operation's potential impact and its political risk. If even one target could successfully claim entrapment, if any aspect of the FBI's methods was ruled improper, the entire operation could be discredited and all prosecutions jeopardized. They proceeded carefully, documenting every decision, ensuring that each target approached had been identified through evidence suggesting existing corruption rather than random selection, and maintaining strict protocols to avoid any appearance of coercion or entrapment. Arricchetti continued serving as the primary intermediary, introducing additional corrupt officials to Abdul Enterprises. His motivation was partly financial, as the FBI paid him for successful introductions, but also seemed to reflect a strange pride in his connections and ability to deliver corrupt politicians on demand. He treated the introductions as demonstrations of his value and influence, proof that he operated at high levels and could access power unavailable to ordinary people. Each meeting followed similar patterns. Arricchetti would vouch for the target, explaining that this was someone who understood how business worked and could be trusted to deliver services in exchange for payment. The target would meet with Tony DeVito, usually at the Long Island house or aboard the yacht, and the conversation would turn to what assistance the sheikh needed and what the official could provide in exchange for money. Senator Harrison Williams of New Jersey became Abscom's highest-ranking target. Williams was 61 years old in 1980, a Democrat who had served in the Senate since 1959 and chaired the powerful Labor and Human Resources Committee. Unlike Myers, Williams was regarded as an intellectual and a progressive, someone who had authored significant legislation on education, labor rights, and urban development. His involvement in Abscom would shock Washington precisely because his public image was that of a serious legislator motivated by policy rather than profit. But the evidence the FBI would gather revealed a different reality beneath that public image, demonstrating that corruption crossed ideological lines and infected politicians regardless of their stated principles or legislative accomplishments. Williams was introduced to Abdul Enterprises through a scheme involving a titanium mine. The scenario was complex, designed to appeal to Williams' intelligence while creating multiple opportunities to document his corruption. The supposed sheikh wanted to invest in mining operations and needed assistance navigating federal regulations and securing government contracts. In exchange for Williams using his influence to help Abdul Enterprises, he would receive an ownership stake in the mining company that would make him wealthy. The arrangement was carefully structured to involve Williams actively and repeatedly, requiring him to make commitments, take actions, and engage in conversations that would establish clear criminal intent. Unlike the straightforward cash for favors transaction with Myers, the Williams investigation required patience and sophistication. building a case through accumulated evidence rather than a single dramatic moment. The meetings between Williams and the Abdul Enterprises representatives, captured on video over several months in late 1979 and early 1980, showed a politician rationalizing his corruption through layers of self-deception. Williams never simply grabbed cash like Myers had. Instead, he discussed the mining investment as if it were a legitimate business opportunity that happened to involve him using his Senate position to benefit his business partners. He talked about arranging meetings with government officials, promising to make calls to agencies overseeing mining regulations, and assuring the Sheikhs' representatives that his involvement would open doors that would otherwise remain closed. The quid pro quo was obvious: his official actions in exchange for financial benefit. But Williams seemed to convince himself that because the money would come through a business investment, rather than direct payment, the arrangement was somehow acceptable. The self-deception was psychologically fascinating and legally irrelevant. Federal corruption law prohibited officials from receiving anything of value in exchange for official acts, regardless of how those benefits were structured. The investigation expanded beyond Myers and Williams to include additional congressmen, each introduction facilitated through intermediaries who had been caught in the FBI's widening net. Representative Raymond Lederer of Pennsylvania was recorded accepting $25,000 and promising to use his position to assist with Abdul Enterprises' business interests. Representative John Jenrette of South Carolina discussed obtaining federal grants for construction projects in exchange for payments, and was captured on video stuffing cash into his pockets while joking about whether his wife would find it when doing laundry. Representative Richard Kelly of Florida actually asked the FBI agents whether the $50,000 they offered him was a loan or a bribe, and when told it was entirely up to him, took the money and said he would consider it a bribe, demonstrating a level of self-awareness about his criminality that was remarkable even in the context of an operation filled with brazen corruption. Representative John Murphy of New York, chairman of the House Merchant Marine and Fisheries Committee, was recorded promising to use his committee position to benefit Abdul Enterprises in exchange for payments and a consulting contract. Representative Frank Thompson of New Jersey, chairman of the House Administration Committee, accepted $50,000 and discussed ongoing payments in exchange for using his influence on behalf of the Sheikhs' interests. Each congressman demonstrated variations in how they rationalized or acknowledged their corruption, but all shared the fundamental willingness to exchange their official positions for personal profit. The video evidence accumulated by the FBI showed not isolated incidents, but a pattern suggesting that corruption had become normalized among a significant subset of elected officials who viewed their positions as assets to be monetized rather than public trusts to be honored. The operation also exposed corruption among state and local officials beyond the original targets. Members of the Philadelphia City Council were recorded accepting bribes in exchange for promises to facilitate business permits and zoning changes. Immigration lawyers, who claimed they could bribe immigration officials to approve visa applications, were caught actually attempting to do so. Associates of various politicians who positioned themselves as influence brokers, claiming they could deliver official actions in exchange for payments, were recorded making those exact promises. The scope of corruption revealed by Abscom suggested systemic problems extending far beyond individual bad actors, pointing to a culture where political influence was routinely bought and sold, where officials at multiple levels of government viewed corruption as normal business practice, and where the intermediaries facilitating these transactions operated openly because they believed such behavior carried minimal risk. By late 1980, the FBI had accumulated evidence against 7 members of Congress, 1 senator, 3 local officials, and numerous intermediaries and influence brokers. The video recordings included hundreds of hours of footage showing officials accepting cash, discussing bribes, promising to use their positions to benefit the supposed sheikh, and demonstrating clear criminal intent through their own words and actions. The evidence was overwhelming, the kind of documentation prosecutors dream of, because it left virtually no room for alternative interpretations or reasonable doubt. But the operation had reached a point where continuing it further risked exposure, and FBI supervisors made the decision to conclude the undercover phase and move toward public disclosure and prosecution. The challenge now shifted from gathering evidence to managing the legal, political, and media firestorm that would inevitably follow when the American public learned that FBI agents had posed as Arab sheikhs to catch sitting members of Congress accepting bribes on camera. The decision about when and how to reveal Operation Abscom involved strategic calculations that balanced legal necessity against political impact. The FBI wanted to maintain secrecy as long as possible to preserve the integrity of evidence and prevent targets from destroying documents or coordinating their defenses. But by early 1980, rumors had begun circulating among defense attorneys and journalists that a major corruption investigation was underway involving members of Congress. Keeping the operation secret much longer was becoming impossible. The FBI and Justice Department decided to move forward with indictments and public disclosure in February 1980, timing the announcement to occur simultaneously with the unsealing of court documents to prevent targets from fleeing or destroying evidence once they learned they had been investigated. The public disclosure of Abscom on February 2, 1980 detonated like a bomb in Washington. The initial news reports revealed that 6 congressmen and 1 senator had been videotaped accepting bribes from FBI agents posing as Arab sheikhs, that the evidence included actual footage of cash changing hands, and that the investigation had been underway for more than 2 years without any public knowledge. The story dominated newspapers, television news, and political discussion for weeks, generating fierce debate about the implications for American democracy, the appropriate limits of FBI undercover operations, and whether the targeted officials should resign immediately or be allowed to defend themselves through the legal process. Some editorial writers praised the FBI for exposing corruption that would otherwise have remained hidden, arguing that the video evidence proved that at least some elected officials were fundamentally corrupt, and that only such audacious investigative methods could have produced proof sufficient to overcome the political protection normally surrounding members of Congress. But the operation also generated significant criticism and controversy. Civil liberties advocates argued that the FBI's methods constituted entrapment, creating opportunities for corruption rather than simply documenting existing criminal behavior. They questioned whether officials who might never have accepted bribes under normal circumstances had been tempted into criminal acts by the FBI's elaborate deception and the presentation of opportunities that seemed too good to refuse. Defense attorneys representing the indicted politicians seized on this argument, claiming their clients had been entrapped by overzealous law enforcement agents who created crimes rather than solving them. The fact that FBI agents had posed as Arabs added another layer of controversy, with some critics charging that the operation relied on ethnic stereotyping, playing on assumptions that wealthy Middle Eastern businessmen were probably corrupt, and that American officials would find bribes from Arab sources particularly attractive or acceptable. Melvin Weinberg became a lightning rod for criticism when his role in designing and implementing Abscom became public. Defense attorneys attacked his credibility, pointing out that he was a convicted con artist who had been paid by the FBI to deceive people, arguing that his involvement tainted the entire operation They portrayed him as the true criminal who had manipulated their clients into illegal acts they would never have considered on their own. Weinberg, characteristically unrepentant, responded in media interviews that he had simply shown corrupt politicians opportunities to do what they were already inclined to do, that no one had forced any congressman to take money, and that anyone who grabbed cash on camera had only themselves to blame for their predicament. His cynicism and lack of remorse for his role troubled some observers, but also reinforced the prosecution's narrative that Abscom had exposed genuine corruption rather than creating it. The legal proceedings began in 1980 and extended through 1981 as each defendant was tried separately. The trials became theaters where fundamental questions about entrapment, governmental ethics, and political corruption were debated before juries who would ultimately decide whether the FBI's evidence proved crimes beyond reasonable doubt or whether the methods used to gather that evidence invalidated the prosecutions. Defense attorneys employed various strategies, some arguing outright entrapment, others claiming their clients had been conducting their own investigations of the supposed sheikhs and were gathering evidence rather than accepting bribes, still others suggesting that the video footage had been edited or taken out of context in ways that made innocent behavior appear criminal. None of these defenses proved effective when prosecutors played the actual video recordings in court. Michael Myers' trial in August 1980 set the pattern for subsequent prosecutions. When jurors watched the video of Myers stating that money talks and bullshit walks while accepting $50,000 in cash, the defense's entrapment claims collapsed under the weight of visual evidence. Myers took the witness stand and attempted to explain that he had been conducting his own investigation of corruption, that he had taken the money only to gather evidence, and that he had always intended to report the incident to authorities. The explanation was implausible on its face and became completely untenable when prosecutors confronted him with the fact that he had never reported anything to law enforcement, had never filed the promised immigration bills, and had kept the $50,000 until FBI agents recovered it during their search of his office. The jury deliberated less than 5 hours before convicting him on all counts. Myers became the first sitting congressman convicted of bribery since the 19th century, and in October 1980, the House of Representatives voted 376 to 30 to expel him, only the 4th time in American history that the House had expelled a member for corruption. The subsequent trials followed similar trajectories. Prosecutors presented video evidence, defense attorneys argued entrapment and government misconduct, and juries consistently sided with the prosecution. Raymond Lederer was convicted in January 1981. John Jenrette was convicted in October 1980 after jurors watched him stuff cash into his pockets on camera. Richard Kelly was convicted in January 1981, despite his attorney's creative argument that Kelly had taken the money as part of his own investigation into FBI corruption. Frank Thompson was convicted in November 1980. John Murphy was convicted in October 1980. Each conviction reinforced the prosecution's narrative that Abscom had exposed genuine corruption rather than creating it through entrapment, that the defendants had demonstrated clear criminal intent through their own words and actions, and that the video evidence left no reasonable doubt about their guilt. Senator Harrison Williams' trial in 1981 became the most closely watched of all the Abscom prosecutions because of his seniority and prominence. His defense was more sophisticated than the others, acknowledging that the video showed him discussing business arrangements with Abdul Enterprises, but arguing that he had never actually used his Senate position to benefit them, and therefore had not committed the crime of bribery. His attorneys presented evidence that Williams had made some inquiries on behalf of the mining company, but had not followed through with substantive actions, suggesting that while his judgment may have been poor, His conduct did not rise to the level of criminal corruption. The prosecution countered that the crime was complete once Williams agreed to use his official position in exchange for financial benefit. That actual performance of official acts was not required, and that the video clearly showed him making such commitments. The jury sided with the prosecution, convicting Williams on all counts in May 1981. He resigned from the Senate in March 1982 rather than face expulsion, ending a 23-year Senate career in disgrace. The convictions validated the FBI's methods and established legal precedents that would influence undercover operations for decades. Federal appeals courts consistently rejected entrapment claims in the abscam cases, ruling that the FBI had provided opportunities for corruption but had not induced criminal behavior through coercion or pressure. The courts distinguished between presenting opportunities to people predisposed to commit crimes and creating criminal intent in people who would not otherwise have broken the law. The video evidence proved critical in making this distinction. Watching the defendants casually discuss bribes, negotiate prices for their services, and accept cash without hesitation demonstrated predisposition far more effectively than any testimony could have. The judicial validation of abscam's methods gave law enforcement agencies confidence to pursue similar undercover operations targeting political corruption, establishing that creative deception and elaborate staging were permissible investigative techniques when used against officials suspected of existing corruption. But abscam's legacy extended beyond its immediate legal outcomes to influence public perception of political corruption and government integrity. The operation demonstrated that corruption existed at the highest levels of American government, that members of Congress would sell their votes and influence for money, and that such behavior had become normalized among at least some elected officials. The video footage, broadcast on television news and replayed in countless news stories, provided visual confirmation of corruption that Americans had long suspected but rarely seen documented so explicitly. Polling conducted after the abscam revelations showed significant declines in public trust in Congress and elected officials generally, contributing to broader cynicism about government that would characterize American political culture in subsequent decades. The operation also sparked reforms aimed at addressing the systemic vulnerabilities abscam had exposed. Congress strengthened ethics rules, enhanced financial disclosure requirements, and created new restrictions on private immigration bills to prevent the kind of corruption Myers and others had engaged in. The House and Senate ethics committees, which had historically been reluctant to investigate fellow members aggressively, faced pressure to take corruption allegations more seriously and to impose meaningful consequences when violations were proven. The reforms were partly genuine attempts to address corruption and partly political theater, designed to reassure an angry public that Congress was cleaning house. The actual impact of these reforms remained debatable, with critics arguing that corruption simply became more sophisticated and better hidden rather than actually declining. For the FBI, abscam represented both triumph and caution. The operation had succeeded beyond initial expectations, exposing corruption that would otherwise have remained hidden and resulting in multiple high-profile convictions. It demonstrated the power of creative undercover work combined with modern surveillance technology to document crimes in ways that made convictions virtually certain. But the operation had also consumed enormous resources, generated significant political controversy, and created legal and ethical questions that persisted long after the prosecutions concluded. Future operations would need to balance the potential value of such elaborate stings against the costs, risks, and ethical concerns they raised. The FBI would continue using undercover operations to investigate political corruption, but never again at quite the scale or with quite the audacity that characterized Abscam. Melvin Weinberg, the con artist whose expertise had made the operation possible, finished his cooperation with the FBI and faded into obscurity. He had been paid approximately $150,000 for his work on Abscam and related investigations, received a reduced sentence on his original fraud charges, and was given a new identity through the Witness Protection Program because of threats from people he had helped convict. In later interviews, he expressed no remorse for his role in the operation, arguing that he had helped expose genuinely corrupt politicians who deserved prosecution. He described the convicted congressmen with contempt, saying they had been easier to con than many of the businessmen he had defrauded during his criminal career, because politicians were so accustomed to corruption that they took no precautions and exercised no caution. His assessment was characteristically cynical, but supported by the evidence his operation had gathered. Anthony Amoroso, the FBI agent who had played Tony DeVito, continued his law enforcement career, but never again worked undercover in a role as elaborate or extended as Abscam. In interviews years later, he reflected on the psychological challenges of maintaining a false identity during months of interactions with targets, describing the constant mental calculation required to stay in character while simultaneously gathering evidence and avoiding legal missteps that could invalidate the investigation. He acknowledged ethical ambiguity in deceiving people, even corrupt people, through such elaborate means, but concluded that the evidence gathered and convictions obtained justified the methods used. He noted that every target who was convicted had made clear choices to accept bribes, that no one had been physically coerced or threatened, and that the operation had simply offered opportunities that corrupt officials willingly embraced. The convicted politicians faced varying fates after their legal battles concluded. Michael Myers served 3 years in federal prison and afterward returned to Philadelphia, where he worked in his family's bar and largely avoided public attention. Harrison Williams served 2 years in prison and afterward worked as a consultant, dying in 2001 at age 81. Raymond Lederer served 3.5 years and returned to practicing law after his release. John Jenrette served 2 years and afterward became a salesman, later reflecting in interviews that accepting the bribe was the worst decision of his life and that he had destroyed a promising political career through greed and stupidity. Most of the convicted officials expressed some form of remorse in later years, though whether that remorse reflected genuine moral reckoning or simply regret at being caught remained unclear. Angelo Ericetti, the mayor whose introductions had facilitated much of the operation, was convicted on multiple corruption charges and served 3 years in federal prison. After his release, he returned to New Jersey, but was permanently barred from holding public office. He gave occasional interviews in which he portrayed himself as a scapegoat, claiming that corruption was universal in politics and that he had simply been unlucky enough to get caught. His lack of genuine remorse and his insistence that everyone else was equally corrupt reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of him as a man who had viewed politics purely as a means of personal enrichment rather than public service. Operation Abscam entered American cultural memory as shorthand for political corruption and creative law enforcement. Referenced in countless news stories, political debates, and popular culture, depictions of government dishonesty. The name itself, derived from Abdul Enterprises and scam, became synonymous with sting operations targeting public corruption. Decades after the trials concluded, Abscam remained the benchmark against which other corruption investigations were measured. The standard example of what creative undercover work could accomplish when properly executed and adequately resourced. Legal scholars continued debating whether the operation's methods were appropriate, ethically justified, and consistent with proper limits on government power. But the convictions stood as proof that at least courts and juries had found those methods acceptable when used to expose genuine corruption. The yacht where Michael Myers had accepted his bribe was eventually sold at government auction. The Long Island house returned to private ownership, and the physical props of Abdul Enterprises dispersed and forgotten. But the video recordings remained, preserved as historical documents that captured a particular moment in American political culture, when elected officials casually sold their offices, when corruption had become so normalized that targets barely attempted to disguise their willingness to accept bribes, and when law enforcement agencies responded with an operation of unprecedented creativity and ambition. Those recordings showed something beyond individual criminal acts. They revealed a system where at least some officials had lost any sense that their positions carried moral obligations, where public service had been corrupted into private profit, and where the trust between citizens and their representatives had been betrayed for stacks of cash on a yacht's mahogany table. In the end, Abscom succeeded, not simply because the FBI's methods were creative, or because the video evidence was compelling, but because the targets were genuinely corrupt, willing to sell their offices without hesitation or significant inducement. The operation worked because Myers, Williams, Lederer, Jenrette, Kelly, Thompson, and Murphy had all crossed internal lines long before the FBI approached them, had all made fundamental decisions that their positions existed to be monetized rather than honored. The FBI's role was not creating corruption, but exposing it, not inducing criminal behavior, but documenting predisposition, not entrapping innocent officials, but catching guilty ones in acts they had clearly committed before and would likely have committed again. That reality, captured on hundreds of hours of video and affirmed by multiple juries, was what gave Abscom its power and what made the operation, despite all its controversial aspects, a legitimate exercise in law enforcement, rather than government overreach. The operation posed uncomfortable questions about how extensive corruption might be among officials never caught, about whether the convicted politicians were aberrations or representatives of a broader culture, and about what mechanisms could prevent such corruption when normal oversight had clearly failed. Those questions remained unanswered, troubling reminders that catching 7 congressmen did not eliminate the systemic conditions that had enabled their corruption. But Abscom also demonstrated that such corruption could be exposed and prosecuted, that officials who betrayed public trust could be held accountable, and that creative law enforcement, combined with modern technology, could overcome the political protections that normally shielded corrupt officials from consequences. That legacy, complicated and contested though it was, represented real value in a system where political corruption too often went unpunished because evidence sufficient for conviction was impossible to obtain. The story of Operation Abscom remains relevant decades later because the fundamental dynamics it exposed, the temptation of power, the corruption of public service for private gain, the normalization of dishonesty among some officials, continue to exist in every system where individuals exercise governmental authority. The specific methods used in Abscom might not be repeatable. The particular vulnerabilities it exploited might have been addressed through reforms. But the underlying human weaknesses that made officials willing to sell their offices for cash persist across time and place. What changed after Abscom was not human nature but awareness. The knowledge captured on video and broadcast to the nation that corruption was real, that officials did betray their trust, and that sometimes, when law enforcement was creative enough and committed enough, such betrayals could be documented and punished. That knowledge, uncomfortable though it was, represented a kind of progress, the replacement of naive trust with informed vigilance, and the demonstration that in a system of laws, even the powerful could be held accountable when their crimes were captured on camera.